There are some winter nights in Montana that feel like the whole world is locked in ice, time suspended beneath a sky so gray it smothers sound. That's exactly how it felt when Grace Ellis slammed her battered Ford truck into park just outside her barn, the engine knocking, headlights flickering against a wall of wind-driven snow. The storm was breaking records on the news, -30 on the thermometer, gusts rattling the barn doors, snow like needles on bare skin. But Grace wasn't thinking about herself. Not really. She was thinking about the desperate cry she'd heard an hour earlier, carried on the wind, raw and sharp enough to slice right through her heart. She pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, boots crunching through knee-high drifts, each breath stinging her lungs. Her little farmhouse stood on the edge of the Bitterroot Valley, a place that could be unforgiving in the winter, where neighbors looked out for each other but also kept to themselves, where the land itself demanded respect and offered none back. Grace had grown up out here, daughter of a school teacher and a ranch hand, and she'd learned early that kindness was a risk. Still, when she heard that sound, a horse's scream, almost human in its fear, she couldn't ignore it. The beam of her flashlight swept the fields. The snow was falling sideways, swirling so thick she could barely see her own gloved hand. She called out, her voice lost in the wind. There, something moved, a dark mass, half buried against a sagging fence post. Grace's heart pounded. She forced her legs forward, fighting panic with every step. The closer she got, the clearer it became. A Mustang mare, wild and gaunt, nostrils flaring in terror, eyes rolling white, and at her side, a tiny foal, crumpled and still, its breath coming in shallow, icy bursts. "Oh God, hang on, girl," Grace muttered, dropping to her knees. She didn't think. She just moved, tugging off her coat, wrapping it around the shivering foal. The mare bared her teeth, too exhausted to fight, but desperate enough to try. Grace kept her voice low, steady, the way her father had taught her when gentling lost calves. "Easy, Mama. I'm here to help you. I promise." The foal's fur was crusted with ice, legs trembling so hard it seemed impossible the little creature could survive. Grace checked for wounds. Nothing fatal, just brutal cold. She fumbled for her phone with numb fingers and dialed her neighbor, Maggie Wilkes. Maggie was a legend around these parts. 60 if she was a day, hands scarred by a lifetime of work, sharper than any vet with a horse in trouble. "Maggie, I need you. Mustangs, now. Bring blankets, whatever you got. It's bad." Grace's words tumbled out, desperate, nearly drowned by the howling wind. 10 agonizing minutes later, headlights swept the field, and Maggie's Jeep crunched to a halt beside Grace's truck. Together they made a plan, no time for debate. They worked as a team, using rope halters Maggie had brought, moving with caution but urgency. The mare stumbled, but didn't resist, as if she knew these women were her only hope. Inside the barn, Grace spread out straw, cranked the ancient space heater, and wrapped the foal in every blanket they could find. Warm water bottles, heated on the wood stove, lined the little body's sides. The mare stood over her baby, shivering but defiant, never taking her eyes off Grace. Grace moved with practiced hands, adrenaline and fear fighting for space in her chest. She'd volunteered with wildlife rescues for years, but this was personal. She could already hear the voices in town, could feel the weight of their judgment pressing against her shoulders. "You brought wild horses onto your land? That's federal property, Grace. You want the BLM down your neck? You're asking for trouble, girl." But in this moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the foal's weak heartbeat, the hope flickering in the mare's eyes. Maggie worked alongside her, steady and unflappable, her hands moving in confident, soothing patterns. "You did right, Grace," she murmured, "no matter what anyone says." As the storm raged outside, time twisted. An hour passed, then two. The foal's breath stuttered, then steadied, then faded again, like a candle caught in a draught. Grace kept up a steady stream of encouragement, whispering, humming old lullabies she barely remembered learning. She felt the chill seep into her bones, but she wouldn't leave the foal's side. Maggie called the wildlife rehab center, voice tense but measured, scribbling notes on a feed bag. Yes, hypothermia, yes, wild. Blankets and heat. What else? Electrolytes, if we can get him drinking. As midnight crawled toward dawn, the blizzard outside slowed. The barn filled with the sound of horse breaths, the ticking of the heater, and the determined, exhausted hope of two women who refused to give up. At one point, Grace closed her eyes and let her head fall against the straw, praying, not for herself, but for these two creatures whose lives now rested in her hands. She knew, as the sky began to lighten behind the swirling snow, that everything had changed. She had crossed a line, and there would be consequences. Maybe fines, maybe worse. But looking at the mare standing protectively over her foal, seeing the faintest flicker of life in those big dark eyes, Grace felt something else, a quiet, stubborn joy. She would fight for these Mustangs, no matter what it cost her. Outside, the wind eased. Inside, hope clung on, fragile but unbroken, and as the first pale light filtered through the barn windows, Grace whispered, "Hang on, little one. You're safe now, I promise." The Montana night outside the barn seemed endless. Wind rattling the rafters, snow pressing against the windows so thickly that Grace Ellis couldn't tell where the world ended and fear began. Inside, the air shimmered with anxiety and determination, the barn's warmth battling the deep, hungry cold that had seeped into the Mustang's bones. Maggie Wilkes worked alongside Grace, her hands never idle, eyes sharp for any sign the mare or her foal might be slipping away. Grace knelt beside the tiny foal, tucking another warm bottle beneath its belly, then sliding her palm across the fragile rib cage. The heartbeat was there, faint, but steady for now. The mare nickered, her breath steaming in the lantern light, ears pinned and tail flicking in warning every time Maggie or Grace shifted too quickly. "She's scared out of her mind," Maggie muttered, glancing at Grace. "But she's got fight left. We just have to keep that baby alive long enough to catch up." They moved quickly, layering on blankets, gently rubbing the foal's legs to coax circulation back. Every few minutes, Grace checked her notes. Simple but crucial details she knew the wildlife authorities would want if this rescue ever turned official. Time of discovery, estimated temperature, visible wounds. None, thankfully, except for a gash above the mare's hock. Interventions attempted. She snapped photos with her phone, documenting everything with trembling fingers. The storm outside howled louder, and for a moment, Grace wondered if anyone would ever know what they were risking tonight. Most of the valley's residents would be hunkered in their homes, fireplaces roaring, maybe watching the news for word of when the blizzard would finally let up. But here she was, her reputation, her future, all laid on the line for a wild mare and a half-frozen foal. Suddenly, the foal's breath hitched, shallow and uneven, its whole body shuddering violently. Grace's heart slammed against her ribs. "No, no, come on, little one, stay with us." Maggie was at her side in a flash, prying open the foal's mouth, gently checking its gums for color. "We need fluids," Maggie whispered, "and sugar if you've got any." Grace sprang to the house, boots thudding across ice, and returned with a bottle of corn syrup and a needleless syringe. With the same care she'd use for a newborn calf, She squeezed tiny drops between the foal's lips. For agonizing minutes, nothing happened. Then, as if summoned by their sheer will, the foal swallowed. A weak, desperate gesture, but one that sent relief flooding through Grace's veins. Time blurred. The women took turns holding vigil. While Maggie fed the old wood stove in the barn's corner, Grace massaged the foal's legs, crooning softly about brighter mornings and warm grass. Whenever Grace's energy flagged, Maggie took over, whispering rough encouragements, her weathered hands steady even as exhaustion dragged at her shoulders. There were moments when they both thought it was over. The foal's breathing would slow to almost nothing, its eyelids fluttering shut. At those times, the silence was so deep that even the wind seemed to pause, holding its breath alongside them. Grace would lean close, pressing her ear to the tiny chest, searching for any sign of life, refusing to accept defeat. "You're not done yet," she'd whisper fiercely. "Not tonight." At one point, the mare stumbled forward, nearly trampling Maggie as she tried to get closer to her baby. For a split second, chaos threatened, hooves thrashing, hay scattering, the foal crying weakly. But Maggie reacted instantly, holding her hands up and stepping between the Mustang and the foal. "Easy now, Mama. We're helping you, not hurting you." The mare's wildness, her fierce need to protect her young, felt like an electric current in the small barn. It reminded Grace of why these horses were so revered and so feared by locals. They were survivors, wild, stubborn, untamable. But tonight, they were also just scared and cold and clinging to hope. Sometime past 3 a.m, Grace dialed the Wildlife Rehab Center again. Her voice cracked as she explained the foal's condition, Maggie's presence, the storm's intensity, and the steps they'd taken. "Keep the foal warm and hydrated," the expert urged, "and document everything. If it makes it to dawn, you might just have saved its life." The hours crawled by. Maggie dozed in a chair, head tipped back, while Grace watched the foal's every breath. Sometimes she found herself praying, sometimes angrily, sometimes pleadingly, sometimes just to keep herself awake. She wondered if her parents, long gone, were watching her from somewhere above, proud or worried or both. Just before sunrise, the foal stirred, a twitch of its ear, a shift of its legs. Grace leaned in, hardly daring to breathe. Then, with a shudder, the foal sucked in a deep, ragged breath and tried, shakily, to stand. The mare let out a long, relieved sigh and nuzzled her baby, licking its ears and nose as if urging it to keep fighting. Grace's eyes blurred with tears. She wiped them away roughly, embarrassed even in front of Maggie. Maggie grinned, her own face softening with relief. "Told you she was a fighter," she said, voice gruff. "Both of you are." They worked together to help the foal up, supporting its weight until its legs stopped trembling. Grace found herself laughing, not from joy but sheer exhaustion and disbelief. "I can't believe it. I really can't. We did it. She's going to make it." By the time dawn stretched pink and gold across the sky, the worst of the storm had finally broken. The barn was filled with the sound of quiet breaths, of the mare and foal nestled together in fresh straw, of 2 women who had given everything they had through a single night. Grace squeezed Maggie's hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. I couldn't have done it alone." Maggie just nodded, her eyes glinting with pride. "Nobody saves the world by themselves, Grace. But tonight, you did right by these horses. That's all anyone can ask." As the first rays of light shone through the frosted windows, the foal, now wide-eyed and curious, lifted its head, as if sensing hope for the very first time. The world outside was transformed when the storm finally loosened its grip. Dawn cast a delicate pink across the snowfields, painting everything in soft light. Icicles clung to the eaves of the barn, and white drifts swallowed the fences. But inside that old wooden structure, it felt as if a different season had arrived, a spring born out of sheer willpower, warmth, and hope. Grace blinked through the exhaustion, her limbs heavy, her mind numb yet alert in a way only sleepless nights could bring. The adrenaline from the rescue had ebbed, replaced by a strange tranquility as she watched the mare and foal nestle together in the golden straw. The foal, impossibly fragile just hours before, now nuzzled at its mother's side, looking for milk with determined little pushes of its nose. The mare had relaxed enough to allow it, though she kept one wary eye on Grace and Maggie at all times. Maggie brought over 2 mugs of strong coffee, the steam curling in the cold morning air. "That little one's got a stubborn streak," she said, a hint of pride in her voice as she handed Grace a cup. "Wonder where she gets it from." Grace managed a tired laugh, glancing down at the foal. "Don't look at me. I'm just stubborn enough to get in trouble, not out of it." They both knew what that meant. Saving the Mustangs wasn't just a matter of compassion. It was a legal and social minefield. Wild horses in Montana weren't like lost dogs or stray cats. By law, they belonged to the Bureau of Land Management. Bringing them in, even to save their lives, could mean fines, court dates, or worse. Grace felt the weight of that knowledge every time her phone buzzed or a truck drove past her icy driveway. Still, in the warmth of the barn, surrounded by breathing, living proof that kindness mattered, it was easy to forget about consequences, at least for a little while. Maggie took first shift, carefully mixing formula to supplement the mare's milk, documenting every ounce the foal managed to swallow. Grace made her way to the house, changed out of her soaked clothes, and returned with her notebook, determined to keep a meticulous record. She sketched the foal's distinctive white blaze, logged the healing progress of the mare's leg, and wrote down the times of each feeding. "They'll need all this if BLM comes around," she said quietly to herself, a knot tightening in her stomach. Between tasks, Grace found herself talking to the animals. "You're tougher than you look, aren't you?" she whispered to the foal, who responded by nuzzling her outstretched hand, warm breath tickling her fingers. The simple act made Grace's heart clench. Such a small gesture, but a sign that trust was possible, even between wild things and humans. She let herself drift into memory as she worked, recalling long ago afternoons with her father in these very stalls, learning to read the moods of horses, to recognize hope in their eyes and fear in the set of their ears. He'd always said the land would test you, but sometimes, if you were lucky, it would also forgive. Midday brought a brief, delicate peace. Maggie read aloud from a battered field manual, double-checking their techniques for warming and rehydrating a hypothermic foal. Grace scribbled notes, snapped photos, and even managed to laugh when the foal, now nicknamed Stormy, let out a whinny as bold as it was squeaky. But the storm had left more than snow behind. It left questions. Would the authorities come knocking? How much time did they have before someone reported the wild horses at Grace's property? Maggie was practical, reminding Grace of the risks. If someone sees tracks or gets word, they might come soon. You know how small towns are. News travels faster than the wind out here. Grace nodded, the uncertainty settling on her shoulders like a fresh fall of snow. "We did what we had to," she replied, her voice firm even as doubt tugged at her. "I'd do it again. I won't let them freeze to death just because someone thinks rules are more important than lives." That night, with the worst of the blizzard past, Grace stood in the doorway of the barn, looking out at the starlit fields. The world was hushed, as if holding its breath. The mare watched her too, eyes dark and reflective in the glow of the old barn light. Grace stepped forward, her boots crunching softly in the straw, and reached out her hand. The mare hesitated, then took a cautious sniff, her nostrils flaring. Not trust, not yet, but something close. Inside, Maggie made up fresh bedding, humming a song from her own girlhood. She didn't speak, but her presence filled the barn with calm, the kind that comes from someone who's seen storms come and go and knows how to wait them out. Before dawn, they swapped shifts, Grace napping in a blanket beside the stall, Maggie making a hot breakfast and checking the mare's leg for swelling. The women worked in harmony, each grateful for the other's company, neither needing to explain why they couldn't walk away. As the days passed, the rhythm of care continued, feeding, documenting, cleaning, soothing. Stormy gained strength. The mare's limp eased, and every moment spent in that barn knit their fates more tightly together. Still, the unspoken question hovered in the space between them. What would happen when the outside world discovered what they'd done? Late that evening, as snow began to fall gently once more, Grace wrote in her journal, her handwriting unsteady but resolute. We saved 2 lives. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but tonight, I know we did the right thing. She looked at the mare and foal, at Maggie, dozing in a rocking chair by the door. In the heart of that battered old barn, hope had survived the storm, but she knew it was only the beginning. Outside, somewhere on the other side of the hills, the world was waiting. And soon, she would have to answer for her choices. The storm left behind more than broken branches and mounded snow. It left the small Montana community humming with rumors and questions. Grace could feel it in the way people paused in their trucks at the end of her driveway a little longer than usual, or how the post office clerk seemed too interested in her brief smile. Still, for a couple of days, the world was silent except for the sounds inside the barn. Hooves against straw, soft wickers, and Maggie's low humming as she mixed feed. The days unfolded in a careful routine, Maggie tending to the mare's bandaged leg, Grace noting every improvement, Stormy wobbling on growing legs and testing the edges of her small, makeshift world. Yet unease shadowed each moment. It wasn't just the uncertainty of the Mustang's health now. It was the awareness that everything they'd built here was temporary, fragile as the icicles clinging to the eaves. On the 3rd morning, Grace heard tires crunching on the icy gravel. A truck, official with county markings, pulled in, followed by another she recognized as belonging to Tommy Briggs, a local rancher whose land butted up against the national forest. Grace's heart jumped as she watched Sheriff Dalton, tall and broad-shouldered in his winter jacket, step out and tip his hat. Dalton's face was carved with lines from years of squinting into the wind, but his eyes were sharp with curiosity and something else. Concern, maybe, or warning. "Morning, Grace, Maggie," he called, approaching the barn. Tommy trailed behind, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Dalton glanced toward the barn door, where Stormy peeked out and raised an eyebrow. "Heard you had a rough night out here during the blizzard." Grace swallowed her nerves, forcing a polite smile. "Nothing we couldn't handle, Sheriff." She glanced at Tommy, who remained silent but looked at the foal with a tight jaw. Dalton didn't press. Instead, he gestured to the fence line, where drifts of snow still buried the lowest rail. "Rumor is, BLM's got a couple agents doing rounds after the storm. Wild horses went missing from the herd north of here. You haven't seen anything unusual, have you?" His tone was casual, but his gaze never left Grace's face. Maggie stepped in, voice calm as spring water. We heard plenty of noise during the storm. Horses get spooked, especially in weather like that. Hard to say what's out there until the snow melts a bit. Dalton nodded, though the warning hung in the air. Tommy shifted his weight, finally breaking his silence. Gotta say, Grace, folks are talking. Wild Mustangs turn up around here. That's federal business. Don't want to see anyone get in trouble. Not you, not the horses. He didn't sound cruel, just resigned, as if the rules themselves were a blizzard no one could control. Grace bristled. We're just looking out for our neighbors, same as anyone. These animals didn't ask for trouble. There was a pause, the kind that fills a room with things left unsaid. Dalton looked away, then back, his tone softening just a little. I get it, Grace. But keep in mind, sometimes doing the right thing means the law comes knocking. Just want you to be prepared. If BLM shows up, make sure you have your records straight. Every detail helps. As they left, Tommy lingered behind, scraping a boot against the snow. You know, back in the day, my old man pulled a filly out of a frozen pond. Saved her life, but lost the herd. Never forgot it. Sometimes you do what you gotta do, but people remember. With that, he trudged after Dalton, leaving Grace and Maggie in the echoing quiet of the barn. The warning was clear. It wasn't just the Mustangs whose lives hung in the balance now. It was their own. Inside, the mare had started to trust Maggie's gentle hands. Stormy, bold, and curious, nosed at Grace's coat pockets, searching for treats. Grace ran her hand over the foal's fuzzy neck, her thoughts a tangled mess of gratitude, fear, and defiance. They're watching, she whispered, but I won't let you go. Not unless it's the only way. Later that day, as Grace cleaned out stalls, a pair of neighbor kids approached the fence, their cheeks rosy and breath-puffing clouds in the cold. Miss Grace, can we see the horses? They'd heard about the rescue. News always traveled fast in a town this size. Grace hesitated, then relented, letting them stroke Stormy's soft nose. Their laughter and wide-eyed wonder reminded her why she'd risked so much in the first place. Maggie watched, her face split in a rare smile. People remember kindness, too, she murmured. That's something the law can't measure. As the afternoon faded, more neighbors stopped by, some bringing leftover hay, others just watching from a distance. A few offered gentle words of support, but there were warnings, too. Mrs. Cutter, who ran the bakery, pressed Grace's hand and whispered, "You be careful, honey. Some folks don't see the difference between right and wrong when it comes to government property." Grace thanked her, tucking the words away like a charm for luck. That night, Grace and Maggie sat side by side in the barn, sipping tea from chipped mugs, the Mustangs drowsing nearby. The fear was still there, but so was something stronger: resolve. No matter what comes, Grace said quietly, we stand together. Maggie nodded, her eyes shining in the lantern light. Let them come. We'll face it. Outside, the wind had finally died, but the storm wasn't truly over. Not for Grace, not for the Mustangs. But in that moment, in the warmth of the barn, they found the strength to believe they could weather whatever came next. By the next morning, the word had spread far beyond Grace's barn, curling through every cafe, feed store, and church pew in the valley. The blizzard's fury had faded, but in its wake a new storm brewed, one made of gossip, judgment, and whispers that seemed to ride on the wind. Grace noticed the difference as soon as she drove into town for supplies. Heads turned in the hardware store. Conversations paused as she passed. People she'd known for years now looked at her with something between curiosity and suspicion. She loaded bales of straw into her truck, feeling the weight of every stare. Behind her, Mrs. Cutter gave a small nod and pressed a loaf of bread into Grace's hands, a wordless sign of support. But Tommy Briggs, leaning against his truck outside, met her eyes with a look that was colder than the snow piled up in the lot. "You making a habit of keeping wild things, Grace?" he called, his voice carrying just far enough for everyone to hear. "Heard the BLM's sending someone up from Helena. Hope you're ready to explain yourself." Grace squared her shoulders, refusing to show how much the comment stung. "I did what I had to, Tommy. You'd have done the same." She saw doubt flicker in his eyes, but he turned away, muttering something to the men beside him. Driving home, Grace's hands trembled on the steering wheel. The Mustangs had brought out the best and worst in people. Some neighbors left bags of apples or old blankets by her gate, quietly offering what they could without drawing attention. Others, like Tommy, seemed determined to make her the center of a fight she'd never wanted. When she got back to the barn, Maggie was waiting, her jaw set in that stubborn line Grace had come to admire. "Got some news," Maggie said, holding out a slip of paper with official letterhead. "You've been served." Grace unfolded the notice with numb fingers. It was from the Bureau of Land Management, a demand that she surrender the Mustangs immediately or face a hefty fine and possible legal action. The words blurred in her vision, but the message was clear. There was no more time to hope the problem would go away. The clock was ticking, and every choice mattered now. She slumped onto a hay bale, the letter dangling from her hand. "They really mean it, Maggie. They'll take them away. Maybe worse." Maggie sat beside her, their shoulders touching in silent solidarity. "We knew this day was coming. You've got records, photos, every feeding and treatment logged. That counts for something." She paused, her voice softening. "But this isn't about paperwork anymore. It's about right and wrong." That night, the barn was quieter than usual. Even Stormy seemed subdued, sticking close to her mother's side, the both of them sensing the tension that filled the air. Grace made her rounds, checking wounds, freshening water, murmuring reassurances she wasn't sure she believed herself. Outside, headlights flickered at the edge of her property, pausing just long enough to make Grace's heart race before disappearing into the night. The next day, Maggie found a box of hay pellets on the porch. No note, but she recognized the handwriting on the bag as one of the neighbor kids. In the mailbox was a different kind of message, an anonymous note scrawled in red ink. "Let them go before you ruin everything for the rest of us. We don't need outsiders sniffing around." Grace crumpled the paper and tossed it in the stove, the flames devouring the threat. She felt the invisible line splitting the community, her friends and neighbors forced to pick sides in a battle that was never meant to be public. The pressure was suffocating, but beneath it, something fierce began to bloom inside her, a stubborn refusal to back down. Maggie noticed the change. "You're stronger than you think," she said one evening as they sat in the barn, sipping coffee from mismatched mugs. "They can't scare you out of doing what's right." Grace forced a smile. "I'm scared, Maggie. I just won't let them see it." Together they reviewed their options, weighing every risk. Surrendering the Mustangs might save Grace from legal trouble, but it would doom the mare and foal to an uncertain fate. Possibly auction, maybe worse. Fighting meant risking fines, maybe even jail time, but it was the only way to honor what they'd started. As dusk settled over the valley, Maggie suggested, "Maybe we find a place to move them. Someone with a license, a sanctuary maybe. It's risky, but safer than waiting for the BLM to show up with a trailer and paperwork." Grace nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. We'd need help. Someone who knows the roads, knows how to handle wild horses in the dark. That night, after checking on the Mustangs one last time, Grace stared out the window at the empty fields. Somewhere out there, a choice was waiting. She could feel the eyes of the town on her, judging, worrying, hoping. But for the first time since the blizzard, she didn't feel alone. The division in the community had shown her something vital. There were people who believed in what she was doing, even if they couldn't say it out loud. In the barn, the foal nickered softly, and Grace smiled. "We're not done fighting yet, little one." Outside, the wind was rising again, but this time Grace was ready for whatever storm might come. The day after the official notice arrived, the atmosphere around Grace's little farm grew heavy with dread. Every time a car engine rumbled in the distance or headlights swept across the snow at dusk, Grace's heart skipped. Maggie was tense too, her humor drying up as she kept her eyes peeled for unfamiliar trucks. Even the animals sensed the unease. Stormy clung to her mother's side, their trust hard won, but now threatened by forces beyond the barn doors. That evening, as the last sunlight faded behind the mountains and the temperature began to plummet, Grace found herself pacing the length of the barn, unable to settle. She replayed her options over and over: give up the Mustangs and betray everything she believed in, or risk everything for a slim chance at saving them. When she heard a knock at the side door, she almost jumped out of her skin. It was Maggie, but she wasn't alone. With her stood Nate Alvarez, a quiet ranch hand who sometimes worked odd jobs for the neighboring properties. Nate was in his early 30s, lean and wiry, with deep lines etched around his mouth from years in the sun. He tipped his hat, eyes flicking between Grace and the stalls. "Maggie says you're in a tight spot," he said quietly, voice low enough not to carry. "I've handled wild ones before. If you want to move them, I know a few back roads. Not easy, but safer than waiting for feds to come knocking." Grace's chest tightened with gratitude and fear. "You'd risk it?" Nate shrugged. "Ain't the first time folks out here bent the rules to do what's right. Just tell me what you need." They sat together in the barn office, the three of them huddled over a battered Montana Road atlas and a steaming mug of Maggie's coffee. The plan came together in tense, whispered bursts. The Mustangs would have to be moved at night, loaded quietly into Nate's horse trailer, an old but sturdy rig with a squeaky latch they greased with oil. Maggie would sedate the mare just enough to keep her calm for the journey. Their destination, a reputable sanctuary in the next county, run by a friend of Maggie's who agreed to take the horses, no questions asked, if they could make the drive before dawn. Grace's mind raced with the logistics. Every step was fraught with risk. They had to avoid the main roads, keep the horses calm and safe, and pray that no one would notice them leaving or ask questions if they did. Nate mapped out a route on gravel backroads, crossing frozen creeks and weaving through pine forests, places only locals knew, places the BLM agents rarely patrolled. By midnight, the plan was set. Maggie prepared a gentle sedative, her hands steady but her eyes betraying nerves. "We only get one shot at this," she whispered, "so we move fast and quiet. No lights, no mistakes." They worked in darkness. The only sounds, the soft shuffle of boots on straw and the muffled breath of the Mustangs. Stormy went first, her small body trembling as Grace and Maggie slipped on a makeshift halter. The mare followed, eyes wide and rolling, but Maggie's touch and the calming herbs worked their magic. Nate backed the trailer to the barn, his headlights off, relying on memory and moonlight to guide him. Loading the horses was tense. Each creak of the trailer seemed loud enough to wake the whole county. But the trio moved with practiced efficiency, hearts hammering, every sense sharpened by adrenaline. The mare balked for a moment, stamping and tossing her head, but Nate murmured softly in Spanish, and she followed Stormy up the ramp. As they secured the doors and covered the trailer's windows, Grace glanced back at her house, its porch light glowing dimly, a silent witness to what felt like both a rescue and a farewell. "If we get caught," she began, but Maggie cut her off. "If we get caught, we'll deal with it. Right now, we get them out." The night was brutally cold. Breath plumed in the air, frost forming on the truck's windshield as they rolled out, headlights off until they'd cleared the end of the lane. Grace sat in the back, clutching her phone, tracking their progress on the map. Every twist and turn felt like an eternity. The wind howled across the fields, rattling the trailer, but inside, the horses stayed remarkably calm, maybe sensing that this was their last, best chance. Halfway through the journey, as they navigated a sharp bend near an abandoned sawmill, the truck shuddered violently. Nate cursed, pulling over to the side of the road. They'd blown a tire. Grace's stomach dropped. "We can't stop here," she whispered, panic rising. Maggie jumped out, flashlight clenched between her teeth, and together she and Nate set to work. Grace kept her ear to the trailer, murmuring reassurance to the Mustangs, praying they'd stay quiet and calm. Minutes stretched painfully long as they jacked up the trailer, hands freezing, fumbling with lug nuts. A car passed on the distant highway, its lights sweeping the trees. Grace held her breath, heart pounding so loud she thought it might give them away. But the car sped on, indifferent to their clandestine mission. At last, the spare was on. They wiped sweat from their brows, breathless and trembling. Nate climbed back behind the wheel, his face set in grim determination. "No turning back now," he muttered. They pressed on, the sanctuary's driveway finally coming into view, just as the sky began to pale with approaching dawn. Grace felt tears sting her eyes, not just from cold or relief, but from the knowledge that they'd managed something extraordinary. They'd beaten the odds. They'd given the Mustangs a fighting chance. Before they unloaded the horses, Grace squeezed Maggie's hand, her voice breaking. "Thank you. I couldn't have done any of this alone." Maggie smiled, weary but proud. Nobody saves the world by themselves, but together, sometimes, we do enough. As the sanctuary's gates opened, Grace allowed herself a moment of hope. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but tonight, they'd outrun the storm. The sky was just beginning to glow with the pale pink promise of dawn as Nate's truck and trailer crunched along the winding road toward the sanctuary. For a few tense moments, the world felt as if it was holding its breath. The only sound, the tires rolling over packed snow and the rhythmic thump of Grace's heart in her ears. The night's perilous journey had left every nerve raw. Maggie's hands were red with cold, and Nate's eyes never left the road, even as the darkness thinned and hints of blue crept into the eastern sky. As they pulled through the sanctuary gates, relief washed over Grace so strongly it was almost dizzying. She looked back at the trailer, her mind whirling with worry. Was the mare all right? Had Stormy weathered the trip? Did the sedative wear off as planned? She pressed her ear against the cold metal, listening for movement inside. Her breath caught as she heard the soft, questioning nicker of the foal and the heavier, reassuring snort from the mare. They'd made it. The sanctuary was quiet at this hour. Frost sparkled on the fence rails, and a few horses stood silhouetted in a far pasture, their breath pluming in the crisp morning air. As Nate parked, Maggie jumped out and strode toward the barn, waving at the figure who emerged from the main house. A broad-shouldered woman in her 40s, wearing a worn Carhartt jacket and a faded baseball cap. This was Susan Harper, the sanctuary director and Maggie's old friend. "Susan!" Maggie called, her voice cracking with fatigue and relief. Susan jogged over, her steps sure despite the ice, and enveloped Maggie in a fierce hug. "You really did it, didn't you?" Susan said, glancing at Grace and then at the trailer, her eyes wide with amazement. "You brought them here, under BLM's nose?" Nate just grunted and jerked his thumb at the trailer. "Let's get them out before they start fussing." The next half hour passed in a blur. Under Susan's direction, the sanctuary team moved like clockwork. The barn was warm and filled with the scent of clean hay. They lowered the ramp and opened the doors. Grace held her breath as the mare, blinking at the sudden light, took her first tentative steps into the unfamiliar space. Stormy hesitated, legs shaky but eyes bright, before following her mother, nuzzling the mare's flank for reassurance. Susan moved quietly and confidently, speaking in low, gentle tones as she inspected the mare's injuries and checked Stormy's temperature. "You two did good work," she murmured, nodding to Maggie and Grace. "We'll get the vet out right away. But they look better than I'd hoped. That foal's a fighter." Grace felt a wave of exhaustion hit her as she leaned against a stall door, all the tension of the past week threatening to collapse on her at once. The sanctuary staff settled the Mustangs into a wide pen at the end of the barn, where a handful of other rescued horses looked on with quiet curiosity. The mare lowered her head and drank deeply from a bucket, while Stormy began exploring, sniffing at tufts of hay and whinnying softly at her new neighbors. Grace watched, her heart full, as the two wild horses began to relax. The walls of the sanctuary, simple, sturdy, clean, felt like a fortress compared to the uncertainty that had haunted every night back home. For the first time since the blizzard, she allowed herself to believe they might really be safe. Still, the victory was bittersweet. When Susan handed Grace a clipboard of emergency paperwork, the weight of responsibility settled back onto her shoulders. "BLM could come around here too," Susan said, her voice quiet but firm. "We keep everything above board just in case. You did right bringing them here. Not everyone would have gone so far." Grace signed her name, her hand shaking a little. She glanced at Maggie, who gave her a reassuring nod. "We got them this far," Maggie said. "That's what counts." Nate, who had been double-checking the trailer and kicking ice from the tires, came to say goodbye. He clasped Grace's shoulder, his expression uncharacteristically gentle. "You did good. Don't let anyone tell you different." He tipped his hat to Maggie and Susan, then drove off into the brightening morning, his figure soon lost in the rolling hills. Grace lingered at the pen, watching Stormy play with another young horse through the rails. The mare, too, seemed lighter, as if she knew her ordeal was over, at least for now. Tears pricked Grace's eyes. She'd promised to protect them, and for the moment, she'd kept that promise. But she couldn't shake the sense of farewell, the realization that her role in their lives was ending, and she'd have to trust others to finish what she'd started. Before leaving, Susan led Grace and Maggie on a short walk through the sanctuary, showing them the paddocks, the rolling pastures, the gentle order of a place built on second chances. "Every animal here has a story," Susan said, her voice full of pride. "But they all have one thing in common. They were saved because someone believed they were worth the trouble." When it was finally time to go, Grace stood by the gate, looking back one last time. The mare raised her head and met her eyes, a look of recognition, maybe even gratitude. Stormy trotted to the fence, reaching out to bump her nose against Grace's hand, soft and trusting. "Be brave, little one," Grace whispered. "You're free now. Run as wild as you dare." Maggie slipped her arm around Grace's shoulders as they walked away. Not all goodbyes are endings. Sometimes they're beginnings you helped make possible. The sun was rising, painting the sky in gold and rose. As the sanctuary faded into the distance behind them, Grace felt something new, a hope unspoiled by fear, a sense that whatever happened next, she'd given her best. The Mustangs were safe, and for the first time in days, she could breathe again. The sun was high by the time Grace and Maggie made it back to the farm, the sanctuary already miles behind them, hidden by the low hills and the winding country roads. The journey back was quieter than the desperate flight of the night before. No pounding adrenaline, no whispered plans, just the soft hum of the truck engine and the occasional clink of Maggie's thermos as she sipped lukewarm coffee. Grace watched the landscape scroll by, her mind spinning with exhaustion, pride, and dread. She wondered what she would find waiting for her in town. She wondered if the worst had passed, or if it was still to come. At her driveway, Grace's heart sank. Sheriff Dalton's patrol car was parked by the mailbox, engine idling. He was leaning against the hood, arms folded, face serious. Maggie shot Grace a look that said, "Here we go." Dalton straightened as the truck pulled in. "Ladies," he greeted, voice even. "Mind if I have a word?" Grace's mouth went dry, but she forced herself out of the truck. "Sure, Sheriff. What's this about?" Dalton glanced over at Maggie, then back at Grace. "Had a visit from the BLM this morning. Word is, the wild horses that wandered off during the blizzard, well, they're nowhere to be found. The agents checked your property. You want to tell me what happened?" Grace felt Maggie's silent support beside her. For a heartbeat, she considered lying, but the past few days had been about courage. She took a breath. "I did what I had to, Sheriff. The mayor and Foal, they wouldn't have survived another night. We got them to a sanctuary out of county. I know what the law says, but I couldn't just watch them die." Dalton held her gaze for a long moment. She couldn't read him. Then, unexpectedly, his posture relaxed. "You broke the law, Grace, no denying that." He let out a slow sigh. "But I just came from a town council meeting. The mayor's phone was ringing all morning. People talking about what you did. Most folks around here, well, they think you did the right thing." Maggie's eyebrows shot up. Grace felt her knees threaten to give out from relief. Dalton continued, "Officially, you might get a warning letter from BLM. But the town council isn't pressing charges. They're calling it community discretion." His lips twitched in the shadow of a smile. "You made a lot of people proud, Grace, even if you rattled a few cages." Grace blinked back tears, barely able to believe what she was hearing. "Thank you, Sheriff. Really." Dalton nodded. "Don't thank me. Thank your neighbors. People remember what matters out here." He pushed away from the car and started to climb in, but paused. "Oh, and you might want to check your porch." After the patrol car rolled away, Grace walked up to the house, Maggie at her side. There, sitting on the worn wooden steps, was a sack of grain and a folded note. The handwriting was rough, but unmistakable, Tommy Briggs. The note was short. "We don't always agree, but you did right by those horses. No hard feelings." Maggie snorted, shaking her head. "Stubborn old fool. That's about as close to an apology as you'll ever get." Grace grinned, heart lifting as the tension began to slip from her shoulders. She carried the grain inside, feeling the weight of judgment replaced by something warmer. Acceptance. Maybe even respect. Word traveled fast in town. By the afternoon, neighbors dropped by, some bringing hay, others just offering a handshake or a quiet nod. The children Grace had helped in the past stopped to say thank you, eyes bright with awe as they asked about the Mustang foal. Mrs. Cutter brought over cinnamon rolls and whispered, "You showed them all what real courage looks like, honey." Still, not everyone was pleased. An anonymous note appeared in Grace's mailbox, warning her that good intentions don't change the law. She tossed it into the trash without a second thought. The balance had shifted. She could feel it in the way people met her eyes on Main Street, in the conversations that paused for a heartbeat before softening with a smile. Even Tommy, once her loudest critic, seemed changed. A few days after the sheriff's visit, she found him fixing a broken slat in her fence, muttering about keeping the deer out. He didn't say much, but when he left, there was a half-bushel of apples on her porch for Stormy, wherever she might be. Grace and Maggie spent the next few days cleaning up the barn, returning things to normal, but nothing felt the same. The Mustang's empty stall was a silent reminder of what they'd done and what they'd risked. Grace found herself missing Stormy's soft whinny, the mare's watchful eyes, but she also felt lighter, like she'd passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. One evening, as the sun set fire to the snowy peaks, Maggie joined Grace on the porch, both cradling mugs of hot tea. "You changed things, you know," Maggie said quietly. "People won't forget." Grace nodded, staring out at the horizon. "I hope not. If anyone else needs help, animal or person, I hope they'll remember that doing what's right is always worth it." The next day, an invitation arrived. The local elementary school wanted Grace to come talk to the children about compassion and standing up for what you believe in. She accepted, feeling the circle of support widen with each new connection. That night, as Grace walked through the dark barn, she paused at Stormy's old stall, resting her hand on the gate. The space was empty, but her heart was full. She had risked everything and found in the end that courage and kindness could change more than just the fate of two wild horses. They could change a whole community. The winter night pressed close against the farmhouse, windows rimmed with frost, wind whistling softly at the eaves. Inside, Grace sat by the fireplace, wrapped in an old wool blanket. Her journal balanced on her knees. The flames danced, casting shadows that flickered across the room, illuminating stacks of paperwork, a chipped mug of tea, and her father's old photograph on the mantel. The quiet was heavy, but for the first time in weeks, it felt comforting rather than foreboding. She let her mind drift back over the whirlwind of the past days, the desperation of the blizzard rescue, the sleepless nights in the barn, the pulse-quickening fear of being found out, the dangerous journey through icy darkness, and finally, the bittersweet farewell at the sanctuary. Every detail seemed sharper now in the hush of her living room. She remembered the wild look in the mare's eyes, the trembling warmth of Stormy against her palm, the unwavering support in Maggie's voice. It was all there, etched into her memory like a scar and a medal at once. Tonight, though, the drama had faded into something else, a deep, almost aching sense of meaning. She opened her journal and began to write, the words tumbling out in a rush. What is heroism really? Is it breaking the rules for the sake of compassion? Is it risking everything for a life that might never say thank you? Or is it quieter? A willingness to stand up even when you're alone, even when you know you'll pay a price. Her pen hovered above the page as she considered the cost. There had been moments, in the darkest part of the storm, when she'd been terrified she was making a terrible mistake, when surrendering the Mustangs might have seemed easier, safer, more reasonable, but each time she'd looked into their eyes and found herself unable to turn away. That stubborn streak had gotten her into trouble more than once in her life. But it was also the reason Stormy and the mare were alive. As she wrote, a sense of clarity began to form, a lesson rising up from beneath the chaos. Sometimes courage isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's a quiet refusal to let fear dictate your actions. It's knowing you might lose and doing what's right anyway. Her reflections were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing on the table. She picked it up and smiled. It was a message from Mrs. Cutter, attaching a photo of the local newspaper front page. The headline read, "Montana Woman's Bravery Saves Wild Mustangs. Community Divided, but Conversation Grows." There was her own blurry photo, bundled up in her barn, smiling sheepishly at the camera. Grace's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but also pride. She'd never wanted attention. She'd just wanted to do the right thing. But the story had struck a nerve. Across town, people were debating wild horse policy, compassion, and the boundaries of the law. Some argued for stricter enforcement. Others rallied for more humane treatment of animals. But for the first time, folks were truly talking and listening. A few days later, Grace received an invitation from the local elementary school. "We'd love for you to speak to the students about your experience, about resilience, kindness, and the responsibilities we all share." She hesitated, unsure what she could say that would matter to a room full of restless kids. But Maggie nudged her. "Just tell them the truth," she said. "Show them that bravery isn't about being fearless. It's about caring enough to act." Standing in front of the children, Grace found herself speaking from the heart. She told them about the blizzard, the fear, the community's mixed reactions, and most of all, about Stormy's fight for life. The children listened, eyes wide, hands shooting up with questions about horses, about rules, about whether she was afraid. Grace smiled, answering honestly, "Yes, I was scared. But being scared is okay. What matters is what you do anyway, who you help and what you stand for, even when it's hard." After her talk, a little girl approached her, clutching a handmade drawing of a horse and a stick figure woman. "This is you and the baby Mustang," she said shyly. "When I get scared, I'm going to remember your story." The gratitude in that small gesture stayed with Grace long after she'd left the school. That night, she sat by the fire again, reflecting on how stories could plant seeds, how acts of courage, big or small, ripple outward in ways you might never see. News of Grace's actions spread beyond the county, picked up by a regional magazine and sparking wider debate. The article described not just the rescue, but the controversy, the risks, and the questions it raised about what it means to live in a place where the wild still matters. Letters poured in from strangers, some critical, some supportive, most grateful that someone had dared to stand up for creatures with no voice. Grace realized then that her story wasn't just about saving a pair of wild horses. It was about challenging the status quo, about giving others permission to question and to care. She wrote in her journal, "Maybe we don't always change the world, but if we're brave, maybe we can change one mind, one law, one heart at a time." She closed the notebook, feeling at peace. The cost of courage was real. She'd lost sleep, risked reputation, and had to live with uncertainty. But the power of courage, she now understood, could echo farther than fear ever could. In the crackle of the fire and the warmth of her home, Grace found the quiet, lasting satisfaction that comes from doing what's right, no matter the outcome. Spring in Montana is a lesson in patience, a slow, stubborn thaw that teases with sunlight, only to slip back into snow. But even in the face of late frost, life refuses to stay hidden. Shoots of grass push through old ice. Birds return with hopeful songs, and in the gentle green hills, the wild horses run again. Months had passed since Grace Ellis last saw Stormy and her mother. Each day, as the snow melted from her fields. Grace wondered how the Mustangs were faring, if they remembered her voice, if the foal had grown into her long legs and bold heart. She kept busy on the farm and in the community, carrying her story to school classrooms and town meetings, watching the debate about wild horses ripple across her neighbors and beyond. Yet every quiet evening, she found her thoughts wandering back to that cold, desperate night and the courage it demanded. The letter arrived in late May, addressed in Susan Harper's tidy handwriting. Grace tore it open on the porch, heart leaping as she read. Stormy and her mama are thriving. Stormy's the fastest in the yearling paddock, and her mother's leg has healed beautifully. I'd love for you to visit. Think they'd like to see a familiar face. Grace wasted no time. A week later, she loaded a box of apples into her battered truck and made the familiar drive out to the sanctuary. The world was greener now, rivers high with snowmelt, pastures alive with dandelions and larkspur. When she pulled in, Susan was waiting by the gate, her face split by a broad, welcoming grin. Thought you'd come, Susan said, hugging her fiercely. They're out in the east pasture. Follow me. Grace's boots squelched through wet grass as she walked beside Susan, nerves fluttering in her chest. As they crested the hill, she spotted them. Stormy, larger and sleeker now, her white blaze shining in the sun, galloping with a loose-legged joy alongside other young horses. Her mother grazed nearby, coat glossy, every inch the wild survivor she'd always been. Grace called out, uncertain, but Stormy lifted her head, ears pricked. For a moment, the foal's gaze fixed on Grace, hesitant, then delighted. With a buck and a toss of her mane, Stormy galloped across the field, sliding to a stop just short of the fence, reaching out with a familiar nicker. Grace's eyes stung as she pressed her hand to the velvet muzzle, feeling the warmth, the memory, the connection that had begun on a night so cold it nearly stole both their lives. Susan watched, arms folded, a soft pride in her eyes. You gave them a chance, Grace. You gave them everything a Mustang deserves: freedom, safety, and a future. They walked the sanctuary together, Susan updating her on every animal's progress. Grace marveled at the sense of hope and recovery that filled the air. There were scars, yes, some visible, some only whispered in the way a horse flinched from a sudden sound. But every creature here was proof that second chances could become new beginnings. Later, Grace sat in the pasture, surrounded by dandelions and sunlight, watching Stormy and her mother graze. She pulled out her journal, scribbling thoughts that had built up in her heart through long, lonely nights. Sometimes, the bravest thing is to do what's right, even if you stand alone. One act of kindness can change a life, a community, maybe even the law. The wild deserves our protection, not just for what it gives us, but for what it teaches us. That survival is courage, that freedom is hope, and that together, we are stronger than any storm. As the afternoon faded into golden light, Susan and Grace leaned against the fence, sharing stories, laughter, and a companionable silence. Grace felt the final knots of worry unwind. The ordeal, the risk, the judgment, the sleepless nights had been worth every moment for this. To see Stormy wild and free, a living symbol of what could happen when one person chose courage over comfort. Back home, Grace found the ripple of her actions continued. Her story had inspired changes, not sweeping new laws, but subtle shifts in attitude. The school children she'd spoken to began organizing supply drives for the sanctuary. Neighbors who once doubted her left wildflower seeds on her porch, anonymous notes of thanks, or asked how they could help. Tommy Briggs, ever gruff, stopped by to say, "Heard you saw your filly again. That's a good thing, Grace, a real good thing." At the next town meeting, the conversation about wild horses was different, less angry, more curious. Grace spoke quietly, not as a hero, but as a neighbor. We can follow the law and still be kind. We can find a better way. And she knew, deep down, that real heroism wasn't loud or showy. It was humble. It was persistent. It was rooted in compassion and a willingness to bear the cost, to stand up for those who couldn't speak. As summer crept in and the valley turned lush and green, Grace often found herself sitting in the fields at dusk, watching the wild horses run in her mind's eye. Their story had become part of her own, a reminder that ordinary people could do extraordinary things, that every act of kindness echoed, that hope could not be tamed. If you drove past her farmhouse late in the evening, you might see her on the porch, boots up, a cup of coffee cooling in her hand, a quiet smile on her lips as she listened to the night. The world was still imperfect. Storms would still come. But Grace Ellis knew now, with every beat of her heart, that she had helped bend her small corner of it toward the good. Sometimes the smallest act, risking warmth, risking safety, refusing to walk away, could change everything. Sometimes the wild found a way home. If you believe in second chances, in courage that changes lives, and in protecting what's wild and free for the generations to come, share this story. True American heroism is humble, persistent, and rooted in compassion. Let's keep the hope unbridled.